Forget everything you think you know about China. Before the Great Wall, before the Forbidden City, before even the first emperor, there was a river. A river so wild, so destructive, it could swallow entire civilizations in a single flood. This is the Yellow River. And on its banks, over 4,000 years ago, a people rose from the mud and chaos to forge something the world had never seen. They didn't have an empire. They didn't have armies of terracotta warriors. They had something far more powerful, the will to survive. This is the story of how a scattered group of tribes along a treacherous river became the foundation of the world's oldest continuous civilization. This is the story of the dynasties of ancient China. But to understand their rise, we must first understand the river that made them, and could have destroyed them. What force could possibly tame a force of nature itself? The river didn't just give them life, it gave them a common enemy. Imagine it, 1,000 villages, each fighting for a patch of high ground, each terrified of the next flood that would erase their homes and their harvests. This was the world of the Longshan people. They were farmers, potters, and warriors, living in a constant state of alert. They didn't have kings or armies, but they had something else, a shared struggle. They built their villages on raised earth platforms, dug deep moats, and created some of the finest black pottery the world had ever seen. But the river was always there, a constant, thundering threat. It was out of this chaos, out of this desperate need for order, that a new kind of leader was born. One who didn't just fight the river, but who tried to control it. His name was Yu. And his legend would become the bedrock of an entire civilization. But who was this man, and what made him different from the countless chiefs before him? Yu the Great. The name echoes through 4 millennia of history. But before he was the Great, he was just a man with an impossible task. His father, Gun, had failed to stop the floods and was executed for his failure. Now, the fate of the tribes fell to Yu. But instead of building higher and higher dams, as his father had done, Yu did something unprecedented. He studied the river. He learned its ways. And then, he made a decision that would change history. He would work with the river, not against it. For 13 years, he traveled the length of the land, dredging channels, redirecting the water, and carving a path for the river to flow into the sea. He passed by his own home 3 times, but never went inside, choosing to dedicate himself entirely to his mission. This was the ultimate sacrifice. And it won him something far greater than victory over the flood. It won him the hearts of every tribe in the land. But what do you do with that kind of power? Yu's triumph over the flood wasn't just a victory for survival, it was a victory for a new kind of leadership. He didn't just command, he served. He worked alongside his people, sharing their hardships. And in doing so, he created a new concept, the mandate to lead. When the aging Emperor Shun looked for a successor, he didn't choose the son of a noble. He chose Yu, the man who had saved them all. This was supposed to be a new beginning. A system where the most worthy ruled, not the most powerful. But Yu, the great engineer, the selfless hero, made a decision that would tear this ideal apart. As he lay dying, he didn't pass the crown to the wisest sage. He passed it to his son, Qi. And with that single act, he shattered the old system and created a new one, a hereditary monarchy. The first dynasty was born. The Xia. But was it a golden age of peace, or the first step into a trap that would enslave millions for centuries to come? The Xia Dynasty. We know it existed. We have the legends, the genealogies, and the stories of its kings. But where is the proof? For centuries, it was a myth, a story told to children. And then, in 1959, archaeologists uncovered a site in Erlitou that sent shockwaves through the world. Here, in the dirt of Hunan province, they found palaces, bronze workshops, and a complex urban society that matched the Xia legends perfectly. But they didn't find a single piece of writing that says, "We are the Xia." This is the great mystery at the heart of Chinese history. Did they simply not use writing, or are we looking for the wrong thing? Their power was immense, their bronze casting was centuries ahead of its time, but their silence is deafening. For over 400 years, they ruled the Central Plains, until a new power emerged from the east, a power that would not just borrow the Xia's ideas, but would perfect them, codify them, and inscribe them in history forever. The Shang. Their arrival would mark the end of myth and the beginning of recorded time. The Shang dynasty didn't just conquer the Xia, they redefined what it meant to be a civilization. They brought with them a terrifying new weapon, the chariot, a machine of war that could crush any infantry. But their true power wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the unseen world of spirits and ancestors. Their kings were not just political rulers, they were high priests, the sole intermediaries between the living and the dead. They communicated with their ancestors through oracle bones, carving questions into turtle shells and ox shoulder blades, then heating them until they cracked. The future of the kingdom, whether to go to war, when to plant crops, was read in those cracks. This was the first written script in East Asia, a direct link to the gods. They built massive tombs filled with bronze, jade, and the bodies of sacrificed servants, all to ensure their king's journey to the afterlife. A dynasty built on blood, bronze, and belief. And in their capital, Yin, they created a power so absolute that it echoed through the ages. But every dynasty, no matter how mighty, writes its own ending. And the Shang, for all their divine authority, were about to face a force even they couldn't control. The seeds of their destruction were already sown. The question is, what would bring them down? And who was the man who would dare to challenge the Son of Heaven? Look closer at the Shang capital of Yin. This wasn't just a city, it was a sacred machine designed to channel the power of the gods. At its heart stood the royal palace, its foundations stained with the blood of thousands. When a king died, his entire world was meant to follow him. Hundreds of servants, warriors, and charioteers were marched into his tomb and buried alive, their bodies arranged to serve their master in the next life. But the bloodshed wasn't reserved for death. On days of grand rituals, the king would consult the oracle bones, and the cracks in the shell would speak. The answer, however, often required payment. A prisoner of war, a slave, would be brought forward. Their life was the currency used to pay the gods for a good harvest or a victory in battle. This was a world where the line between the living and the dead was paper-thin, and the king stood at the edge, holding the knife. For centuries, this brutal contract with the divine kept the Shang in power. But it was a contract that would eventually demand too high a price. The Shang's power, however, was never absolute. They were surrounded by rival tribes and kingdoms, some of whom were their vassals, but many were not. To the west, along the Wei River Valley, a people known as the Zhou were growing in strength. They were considered barbarians by the Shang court, a rustic people who knew more about farming than about the intricate rituals of the capital. But the Zhou were shrewd. They bided their time, paying tribute to the Shang kings while secretly forging alliances with other disgruntled tribes. They watched as the Shang court became consumed by decadence and cruelty. The final Shang king, Xian, was said to be a brilliant but monstrous ruler. He built a lake of wine and a forest of hanging meat. He listened to music, not of the court, but of the wild. He ignored the pleas of his advisors and trusted only his favorite consort, Daji, a woman of legendary beauty and cruelty. The stories say she took pleasure in watching people suffer. The mandate of heaven, they believed, had been withdrawn from the Shang. The question was, who would have the courage to seize it? For decades, the Zhou endured the Shang's arrogance. Their leader, King Wen, was a wise and just man, and many began to see him as a true king. He was a master of strategy, not just in war, but in the hearts of men. He freed the innocent from Shang's prisons and attracted talent from across the land. His son, King Wu, was the hammer to his father's anvil. While King Wen prepared the minds of the people, King Wu sharpened the swords of his army. But even as they prepared, they knew a direct assault on the Shang capital was suicide. The Shang army was legendary, with its chariots and bronze weapons. So, King Wu waited. He sent spies to the Shang capital and they returned with tales of a king lost in pleasure, a court deaf to reason. The people were miserable, they said. The soldiers were demoralized. The moment, King Wu realized, was not when the Shang was strongest, but when they were weakest in spirit. He gathered his allies, not just the Zhou tribes, but every kingdom that had felt the sting of Shang cruelty. And in 1046 BC, he took a deep breath and gave the order to march. The clash happened at a place called Mai, the wilderness of the shepherd. It was a field outside the Shang capital, and it was here that the fate of the dynasty would be decided. King Wu's army was a coalition, a force of perhaps 50,000 men, but they were fighting for a cause. They believed they were restoring balance to the world. Xia, finally roused from his stupor, assembled his own massive army. Some records say it was over 500,000 strong. But many of these soldiers were not loyal warriors, they were slaves and prisoners, forced to fight for a king they despised. They were given weapons and pushed to the front lines. As the two armies faced each other, the tension was unbearable. The Shang chariots were lined up, their bronze blades gleaming in the morning sun. For a moment, the outcome seemed inevitable. But then, the unthinkable happened. The Shang vanguard, the very slaves who were meant to be the first wave, threw down their weapons and turned. They didn't just flee, they turned and fought their own masters. The Shang lines collapsed into chaos. The mighty army of the Son of Heaven was in full retreat before the battle even truly began. Xia, watching his power crumble, knew there was no escape. The Shang king, Xia, didn't fall on the battlefield. He retreated to his palace, his dear terrace pavilion, a tower of luxury where he had once watched his victims writhe in agony. He watched his world burn from his window, the flames of his own capital licking the sky. He knew he had lost everything. His kingdom, his army, his gods, all had deserted him. Dressed in his richest jade ornaments, he walked to the edge of his terrace and, with a final act of defiance or despair, he threw himself into the flames. The dynasty that had ruled with bronze and blood for over 5 centuries was gone, consumed by the very fire it had used to communicate with the gods. When King Wu entered the city, he found it in ruins. He found the body of Xia and, in a brutal display of justice, he shot 3 arrows into the corpse and then severed the head with a sword. He did the same to Daji. The Son of Heaven was dead. The Shang had fallen. And a new era was about to begin. But what would prevent the Zhou from becoming the very thing they had destroyed? King Wu's triumph was total, but his victory was fragile. He had conquered the Shang, but he hadn't yet won the hearts of the people. He needed a story, a justification, not just for himself, but for every kingdom that had followed him. The Zhou had a concept, a brilliant political philosophy that would legitimize their rule for the next 800 years, the mandate of heaven. They declared that heaven itself had grown tired of the Shang's corruption. The Shang had been given the mandate to rule, but they had proven themselves unworthy. They had neglected the gods, oppressed the people, and indulged in monstrous cruelty. Heaven, in its infinite wisdom, had therefore withdrawn its favor and bestowed it upon the virtuous Zhou. This wasn't just a conquest, it was a moral imperative. It was a divine judgment. King Wu wasn't just a warlord, he was the instrument of heaven's will. This was a powerful idea. It meant that no dynasty was eternal. Its right to rule was conditional on its moral conduct. It was a warning to future tyrants, and a promise to the people. But this new dynasty had a new problem. The Shang's gods were still there, their temples were still standing, and their people still believed. So, what do you do with the old gods? You don't destroy them. You make them your ancestors. And that, my friends, is a secret that would shape China's soul for millennia. But a new power comes with a new capital, a new order, and a new challenge. And the Zhou, for all their virtue, were about to face a challenge that would test their own mandate from heaven. Who would be the first to break the new rule? And what would be the cost? King Wu stood amidst the ashes of the Shang capital, the stench of smoke and death still heavy in the air. He had won, but the silence was deafening. The Zhou army, once a coalition of tribal allies, now stood as conquerors in a land that didn't trust them. The Shang's vast network of loyal cities hadn't surrendered, they were just waiting. Every day, messengers arrived with reports of unrest, of nobles testing their new master's resolve. Wu knew that the mandate of heaven was a powerful story, but stories don't fill empty stomachs or quell the whispers of rebellion. He had to secure his rule, not with just bronze and arrows, but with a structure that could hold a kingdom together. He looked east, towards the heart of the conquered territory, and made a decision that would echo through history. He wouldn't just rule from his own lands. He would establish a new capital, a great city called Hao, to be the unshakable heart of his new dynasty. But first, he had to deal with the ghosts of the past. But King Wu's first move was a masterstroke of political genius. He didn't just destroy the Shang legacy, he absorbed it. He found the surviving son of the last Shang king and, instead of executing him, he granted him a small fiefdom. He gave the defeated dynasty a place, a title, and a future. It was a calculated act of mercy. It told every noble in the land that submission would be rewarded, that the mandate of heaven was not about annihilation, but about order. To the Zhou, he gave lands and titles, creating a network of loyal lords who owed their power directly to him. He was building a feudal system, a pyramid of loyalty with himself at the apex. But below the surface, the cracks were already forming. His brothers, who had fought so valiantly beside him, were growing envious. They had bled for this dynasty, yet the greatest rewards were going to other families. The whispers began in the corridors of his new palace. A dangerous question was taking root in the minds of his own kin: if the mandate of heaven could be transferred from the Shang to the Zhou, why couldn't it be transferred again? The whispers grew louder. King Wu's health, weakened by years of hard campaigning, began to fail. The man who had toppled an empire was now confined to his chambers, his body racked with fever. His heir was a young boy, far too young to rule. This was the moment of maximum danger. The mandate of heaven was a beautiful theory, but it couldn't hold a sword. Power, in the ancient world, belonged to whoever could wield it. And there was one man who could. The king's brother, the Duke of Zhou. He was a brilliant strategist, a scholar, and a man of immense ambition. He stood by his brother's bedside, watching the life drain from the conqueror. He saw the fragility of all they had built. He knew that without a strong hand, the Zhou dynasty would crumble into civil war, with his own brothers fighting over the scraps. The Shang loyalists were already stirring, sensing weakness. The entire kingdom was a powder keg, and the spark was about to be lit. The Duke of Zhou had a choice to make, a decision that would define his legacy forever. Was he a loyal servant, or a man who would seize destiny? And then, the unthinkable happened. King Wu, the founder of the Zhou dynasty, was dead. He was gone, leaving behind a kingdom that was barely 3 years old and an heir who was still a child. The capital was in mourning, but it was also in chaos. The Duke of Zhou stood at a crossroads. He could place the young king on the throne and rule as a regent, but his other brothers, who were just as ambitious and far less principled, were already eyeing the throne. They spread rumors that the duke himself had poisoned the king to seize power. The accusations were poison, and they spread faster than any fire. In the eastern territories, the old Shan nobles saw their chance. They allied with the duke's disgruntled brothers, raising an army to march on the capital. The mandate of heaven was about to be tested in the crucible of civil war. The Duke of Zhou had to act. He had to prove his loyalty, not with words, but with blood. He would have to fight his own brothers, his own flesh and blood, to save the dynasty his brother had created. The fate of China hung in the balance. The Duke of Zhou didn't hesitate. He left the capital with an army, marching east to crush the rebellion. It was a brutal campaign. He wasn't just fighting rebels, he was fighting his own brothers. The war was a mess of shifting alliances and betrayals. The Duke, however, proved to be as brilliant a general as he was a politician. He methodically dismantled the rebel forces, city by city. He showed no mercy to the leaders, executing them publicly as a warning. The rebellion collapsed, but the cost was immense. The lands were devastated, and the trust between the royal family was shattered forever. The Duke of Zhou returned to Hao, not as a triumphant hero, but as a man hardened by the necessity of his actions. He knew that he had secured the throne for his nephew, but he had also made enemies for life. The Shan were finally broken, but the Zhou dynasty was now scarred. The question was no longer about the mandate of heaven. It was about the price of power. And the Duke had just shown everyone the answer: the price was everything. The Duke of Zhou had saved the dynasty, but at what cost? He had defeated his brothers, but he had also proven that the mandate of heaven could be enforced with a sword. He had secured the throne for his nephew, but the boy king was now a puppet. The Duke ruled in his name, making every decision, commanding every army. He was the true power behind the throne. He built schools, codified rituals, and strengthened the feudal system, creating the foundation for what would become the classical Zhou culture. But for all his brilliance, he was a man living with a shadow. He had killed his kin to protect the realm. He was feared more than he was loved. And in his quiet moments, he must have wondered if his own actions had set a precedent. He had shown that a regent could take power, that a brother could be a king. He had created a system that would be exploited for centuries. The mandate of heaven was secure, but the soul of the dynasty was tainted. So, as he stood before the oracle bones, asking the gods for guidance, a new, dark question formed. If the Duke of Zhou could wield this much power, what would stop the next regent from simply taking the throne for himself? The answer would come soon enough, in a betrayal that would make the Duke's own actions look merciful. But that is a story for another time. What do you think happens when the shield of a regent becomes the sword of a tyrant? Subscribe to uncover the next chapter of this dynastic saga. The Duke of Zhou had restored order, but the peace he built was a fragile one, held together by his iron will. For 7 years, he ruled as regent, his every action a masterclass in political survival. He reorganized the entire kingdom, creating a network of feudal states loyal to the Zhou crown. He codified the rituals that would define Chinese culture for millennia. But as his nephew, King Cheng, grew from a boy into a man, a question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. When would the Duke step aside? The court was a nest of whispers. Some praised his loyalty, others, with envy in their eyes, accused him of hoarding power. They said he was no better than the tyrants he had overthrown. The Duke heard these whispers, but he remained silent. He knew that power was a poison, and he had drunk deeply from the cup. He waited, watching his nephew's every move, searching for a sign of readiness. The moment he had been both dreading and anticipating finally arrived. King Cheng, now a young man with a will of his own, summoned his uncle to the great hall. The court held its breath. The Duke of Zhou did not cling to power. In a move that stunned the court, he knelt before his nephew and offered him the seal of the regency. He spoke of his duty fulfilled, of the mandate of heaven now resting securely on the young king's shoulders. He asked only to retire to his fiefdom in Lu, to live out his days in peace. It was a brilliant move. By surrendering power, he cemented his legacy as the ultimate loyal subject. He became the model of virtue that Confucius would later worship. But was it truly selfless? Or was it the final, most cunning act of a man who knew that the only way to survive a king's suspicion was to become his most trusted servant? King Cheng, moved by his uncle's gesture, begged him to stay. But the duke was resolute. He left the capital, leaving behind a vacuum that would soon be filled by ambition. The young king was now truly alone, surrounded by advisors and relatives who all had their own agendas. The stability that the duke had fought so hard to create was about to be tested once more. The Game of Thrones never truly ends, it only changes its players. King Cheng was not the weak puppet his enemies hoped for. With the Duke of Zhou gone, he emerged from the shadow of his uncle and began to rule with a surprising firmness. He continued the duke's policies, but he also made them his own. He led military campaigns to the east, finally crushing the last remnants of Shang resistance. He expanded the kingdom's borders and brought new tribes under the Zhou banner. For a time, the dynasty flourished. This period of peace and expansion became known as the Golden Age of the Western Zhou. It was a time of great cultural achievement, of bronze casting and poetry, of ritual and music. But beneath the golden surface, cracks were forming. The feudal lords, who had been given lands and power to govern, were growing more independent. They built their own armies, collected their own taxes, and began to see themselves not as servants of the king, but as kings in their own right. The bonds of loyalty, so carefully forged by the Duke of Zhou, were beginning to fray. The center could not hold forever, and the periphery was growing restless. The very system designed to maintain order was now planting the seeds of its own destruction. The cracks in the foundation became chasms under the successors of King Cheng. Generations of kings sat on the throne, but few possessed the strength of their ancestors. They were born into luxury, raised in the confines of the palace, and knew little of the hardships of their people. They were more interested in the pleasures of the harem and the hunt than in the affairs of state. The feudal lords watched the throne's authority wane with each passing year. They began to form alliances, not with the king, but with each other. They married their children to one another, building their own power blocks. The royal court became a den of intrigue, where eunuchs and consorts fought for influence, and the king was merely a pawn in their games. The mandate of heaven was a beautiful theory, but what did it mean when the king was clearly unworthy? A new king, King Yi, took the throne, and he proved to be more interested in asserting his own authority than in maintaining the balance. He humiliated a powerful lord, causing a deep resentment. The lords began to see the king not as a sacred figure, but as a rival. The stage was set for the first great rebellion against the Zhou crown. The rebellion came, as it always does, from the most trusted. The lord that King Yi had humiliated, the Duke of Qi, did not strike out in anger. He was patient. He waited years, secretly building a coalition of disgruntled lords. He spread whispers of the king's incompetence, of his moral failings, of his disrespect for the ancient rituals. He used the very concept of the mandate of heaven as a weapon against the king. If the king is virtuous, he argued, the heavens will protect him. But if he is corrupt, the heavens will abandon him. It was a dangerous argument, one that had been used to justify the fall of the Shang. Now, it was being turned against the Zhou. In 841 BC, the capital erupted in chaos. The people, driven to desperation by high taxes and famine, rose up. The king, King Li, was forced to flee for his life, becoming the first Zhou king to be exiled. The kingdom was thrown into a state of emergency. A group of powerful lords, led by the Duke of Qi, stepped in to fill the power vacuum. They formed a temporary regency, known as the Gonghe period, a collective rule by the nobles. It was the first time in Chinese history that the ultimate authority did not reside in a single king. It was a revolutionary act, and it would have profound consequences. The Gonghe Regency was a temporary fix, a desperate measure to hold the kingdom together. It lasted for 14 years, a period of relative peace and stability. But the lords who ruled had no legitimacy. They were not of the royal bloodline. They were merely powerful men who had seized the opportunity. When King Li died in exile, they placed his son, King Xian, on the throne. King Xian was a capable ruler, and he managed to restore a degree of royal authority. He pushed back the barbarian tribes and reasserted control over the feudal lords. For a time, it seemed as if the Zhou dynasty might be revived. But the damage was done. The precedent had been set. The lords had tasted power, and they had seen that the king could be challenged. They had learned that the mandate of heaven was not a divine right, but a political tool. They had learned that the throne was not untouchable. The story of the Western Zhou was no longer about the rise of a dynasty. It was about its long, slow, agonizing decline. The next king, King Yu, would be the one to finally break it. His story is one of obsession, betrayal, and a beacon fire that would burn the kingdom to the ground. But that is a tale for the next episode. What act of madness could possibly doom a dynasty that had survived for centuries? Subscribe and find out, as we uncover the final, tragic chapter of the Western Zhou. But before the beacon fires could ever be lit, a new threat was already coiling around the heart of the Zhou kingdom. It did not come from the north, where the barbarian tribes howled at the borders. It came from the south, from the swamps and river valleys of the Chu region. The lords of Chu had always been seen as semi-civilized, their rulers bearing the title of Viscount, a rank far below the dukes and marquises of the Central Plains. But they had grown rich on the trade routes and powerful on the back of their fierce warriors. They had begun to adopt the rituals and ceremonies of the Zhou court, but with a dangerous twist. They performed them in secret, in their own temples, with their own ancestral spirits. They were building a separate identity, a rival claim to the mandate of heaven itself. The Zhou king sent envoys and armies, but the Chu simply absorbed them, learning their tactics and turning their own weapons against them. The south was no longer a frontier, it was a cancer. The rot, however, was not just on the borders, it was at the very heart of the court. The son of King Xian, King Yu, ascended the throne in 781 BC, inheriting a kingdom that was fraying at the edges. He was not a warrior or a statesman, he was a man of appetites, obsessed with pleasure and beauty. His court became a den of sycophants and schemers. The old rituals, the very glue that held the Zhou world together, were neglected. The lords who came to pay homage were treated with disrespect, their grievances ignored. The king's greatest weakness, however, was his infatuation with a woman named Bao Si. She was a concubine of breathtaking beauty, and the king was utterly bewitched. She gave him a son, and the king, in a reckless act of passion, decided to depose his rightful queen and crown prince, replacing them with Bao Si and her child. This was not just a family squabble. It was a violation of the sacred order, an insult to the powerful families who supported the queen. It was an act of madness that would shatter the fragile peace, and it gave the disgruntled lords the perfect excuse they had been waiting for. But Bao Si was no mere pawn. She was haunted by a deep sorrow, a melancholy that even the king's lavish gifts could not cure. She never smiled. The king, desperate to see his beloved happy, tried everything. He held grand feasts, staged spectacular hunts, and brought in the finest musicians, yet her face remained a mask of indifference. One day, a corrupt minister, seeking to curry favor, suggested a cruel and dangerous game. "The beacon towers, your majesty," he whispered. "Light the beacon fires. The lords will rush to defend the capital, thinking there is an invasion. When they arrive, tired and anxious, they will see there is no enemy. The sight of their futile rush will surely amuse the queen." The king, blinded by love, agreed. He ordered the beacon fires lit. The signal blazed across the hills, and from every corner of the kingdom, loyal lords and their armies marched day and night to the capital. They arrived to find the gates wide open and the king laughing with his concubine. The lords were exhausted, humiliated, and furious. And for the first time, Bao Si smiled. It was a beautiful, cruel smile that sealed the fate of the Western Zhou dynasty. The king's betrayal did not go unnoticed. The lords returned to their domains with a burning sense of injustice. They had been made fools of, their loyalty mocked. The queen who had been deposed, and her father, the powerful Marquis of Shen, saw their opportunity. They sent a secret message to the Chuanrong, a fierce barbarian tribe from the west, inviting them to attack the capital. It was a treasonous act, but it was born from the king's own treachery. In 771 BC, the Chuanrong horde descended upon the Zhou capital like a wave of destruction. The king, caught completely off guard, ordered the beacon fires lit once more. He lit them again and again, but this time, no lords came. They had been tricked too many times, and they were not willing to sacrifice their men for a king who had mocked them. The capital was sacked. The king was killed, his body left in the ruins. Bao Si was captured by the barbarians, her fate lost to history. The Western Zhou dynasty, which had stood for nearly 3 centuries, collapsed in a single night of fire and blood. It was a death that was not just political, but spiritual. The Son of Heaven, who was meant to be the link between the mortal world and the divine, had been slain by barbarians. The death of King Yu did not end the Zhou dynasty, but it shattered its legitimacy. The lords who had survived the chaos gathered to pick up the pieces. They could not let the line of kings die, for that would mean the end of the world as they knew it. They placed the son of the deposed queen, a prince named Yijiu, on the throne. He would be known as King Ping, and he would be the first king of the Eastern Zhou. But the new king was a refugee, a ruler without a home. The capital of Haojing was in ruins, and the surrounding lands were too dangerous. He was forced to move his court eastward, to the city of Luoyang, a city that was safe from the barbarian raids. This move was more than a change of address. It was a symbol of the king's diminished authority. He was no longer the master of the Western Plains, he was a guest in the East, dependent on the goodwill of the powerful lords who had placed him there. The king's power was now only ceremonial, a relic of a bygone age. The real power lay with the feudal lords, the dukes and marquises who controlled the armies and the resources. The age of the king was over. The age of the warlords was about to begin. King Ping's reign marked the official beginning of the Eastern Zhou, but it was a hollow victory. The dynasty would limp on for another 5 centuries, but it would never again be the true ruler of China. The kings were now figureheads, their authority reduced to religious ceremonies and the distribution of titles. The real power was in the hands of the great feudal lords, men like the Duke of Qi, the Duke of Jin, and the Duke of Qin. They were the ones who commanded armies, collected taxes, and made war. They paid lip service to the king, but they knew the truth: the mandate of heaven was now a prize to be fought over, not a divine right to be inherited. The story of the Zhou was no longer a story of kings and their courts. It was a story of ambitious lords, shifting alliances, and brutal wars. The story of China was now a story of the spring and autumn period, a time of chaos and opportunity. The beacon fires that had once signaled the king's call to arms were now silent. But a new call was about to echo across the land, a call not for defense, but for dominance. The first to answer would be a man who would redefine what it meant to be a ruler, and his name would become a legend. But who was this man, and how did he rise to power in this new, ruthless world? Subscribe to find out, as we enter the age of the hegemons and uncover the story of Duke Huan of Qi, the first man to bend the Zhou kings to his will. The beacon fires that once united the realm were silent now, but the ambitions they had once kindled were burning hotter than ever. King Ping was a ghost in the palace at Luoyang, a king who could not command a single army or levy a single tax without the permission of his so-called protectors. In the east, the state of Qi was rising, its lands fertile, its ports busy, and its ruler, Duke Huan, was a man who understood that the mandate of heaven was not given, but taken. He had a secret weapon, not a sword or a wall, but a man named Guanzhong, a former enemy who had tried to kill him. Instead of revenge, Duke Huan offered him power. This was a new kind of politics, where loyalty was bought with opportunity and wisdom was the sharpest blade in the armory. The question that echoed through every court in China was simple: could a man with a grudge and a brilliant mind forge a new order from the ashes of the old? Guanzhong was not a warrior, he was a thinker, a man who saw the world in terms of systems and incentives. He convinced Duke Huan that raw force alone would not secure dominance. They needed a cause, a banner that all the other lords could rally behind. The Zhou king was weak, but his title was still sacred. So they invented a policy that would become the most famous political doctrine of the age: honor the king, and repel the barbarians. It was a brilliant stroke. By being the king's most loyal protectors, they could act in his name, and anyone who opposed them could be branded an enemy of the throne. This was not just a military strategy, it was a masterclass in political legitimacy. With this slogan, Duke Huan could march his armies across China, not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He was building an empire, but he was doing it by making everyone believe it was their own idea. The real war for China would not be fought with swords alone, but with ideas. The first test of this new policy came from the north. The barbarian tribes, the Di and the Rong, were sweeping down from the steppes, sacking cities and enslaving the people. The smaller states were terrified, and they begged for help. Duke Huan and Guanzhong saw their opportunity. They led a coalition army northward, a mighty force of chariots and infantry from several different states, all united under the banner of Qi. The battle was brutal, but the coalition was victorious. The barbarians were pushed back beyond the Great Wall, which was still being built. This victory was more than a military success, it was a political masterstroke. Duke Huan had saved the Chinese states from annihilation and had done it in the name of the Zhou king. He returned to Luoyang a hero, and the king had no choice but to shower him with honors. The other dukes saw the power of this strategy. They could either join Duke Huan or be left behind, and the first true hegemon of China had emerged. But not everyone was impressed by Duke Huan's rise. In the south, the state of Chu had been growing in power and arrogance. Its ruler, King Cheng, had long since stopped using the title of duke and had declared himself king, a direct challenge to the Zhou throne. He was a threat to the new order that Qi was trying to build. Duke Huan knew he could not ignore this challenge. He led a massive coalition army southward, the largest force ever assembled in China at that time. The two armies met at a place called Zhaoling, and for a moment, it seemed like a war that would decide the fate of China was inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. Guanzhong, ever the strategist, stepped forward. Instead of demanding a battle, he demanded an apology. He asked King Cheng to acknowledge the authority of the Zhou king and to pay tribute, a simple act of submission. King Cheng, seeing the size of the coalition army, agreed. The war was averted, and Duke Huan had won an even greater victory without shedding a drop of blood. Duke Huan was now the undisputed master of the Chinese world. He had the king's ear, the loyalty of the smaller states, and the respect of his enemies. He organized a grand meeting at Kuaichou, where all the feudal lords swore an oath of alliance, pledging to protect the king and to defend each other from aggression. This was the peak of his power. He was not just a warlord, he was the architect of a new international order. But even as he stood at the summit, cracks began to appear. His trusted advisor, Guanzhong, was growing old and ill. Duke Huan himself was aging, and he had many sons, all of whom had their eyes on the throne. The court of Qi was becoming a nest of intrigue and ambition. The great project of maintaining the alliance required constant attention, and Duke Huan was becoming distracted. He was a great leader, but he had not built a system that could survive him. He was a giant standing on the shoulders of another giant, and the ground beneath them was starting to crumble. When Guanzhong died, Duke Huan was lost. He made a series of terrible decisions, trusting the wrong advisors and alienating his allies. The coalition he had built began to fracture. His sons, sensing his weakness, began to fight over the succession. In 643 BC, Duke Huan died, and his sons' rivalry erupted into a bloody civil war. The body of the first great hegemon lay in his palace for over 2 months, unburied and rotting, as his sons fought over his empty throne. The vision of unity he had built was shattered, and China was plunged back into chaos. The age of the hegemons had begun with a brilliant light, but it was ending in a dark and bitter struggle. The other states, the Duke of Jin, the Duke of Qin, and the upstart kings of Chu, were all watching. They learned that power was not built on alliances or ideals, but on the cold, hard reality of military might. The next chapter of this story would be written with blood and iron. But who would be the next to try to claim the mandate of heaven? And what would happen to the fragile order that Duke Huan had created? Subscribe now, and we'll uncover the rise of the next great power, the state of Jin, and the ruthless duke who would tear the world of the hegemons apart. The funeral pyres of Qi had barely cooled before the wolves began to circle. Duke Huan was dead, his body rotting in a palace his own sons had turned into a battlefield. The alliance he had built, the grand vision of a united front against chaos, dissolved overnight. Now, every minor lord with a banner and a grudge saw a chance to carve out his own kingdom. And watching from the wings, patient and hungry, was the southern titan, Chu. King Qing of Chu had never bowed to the Northern Alliance. He had watched Duke Huan's rise with contempt, and now he smelled opportunity. He didn't want to be a hegemon, he wanted to be a king, the true son of heaven. The question that hung in the air, thick as smoke, was this: who was bold enough, or foolish enough, to stand in his way? And that's when a ghost walked back into the world of the living. His name was Chong'er, a prince of Jin, and for 19 years, he had been a wanderer. Betrayed by his own family, hunted by assassins, he had fled from state to state, a beggar with a royal name. He had been insulted, starved, and forced to eat dirt to survive. But he had watched. He had learned. He had gathered around him a band of loyal followers, men who believed that this ragged prince was destined for greatness. They saw in his eyes a fire that hardship had not extinguished, but had forged into a cold, calculating steel. Now, Jin was in chaos, and its throne was empty. The wanderer was coming home, and he wasn't coming back to beg. He was coming back to claim what was his. When Chong'er finally took the throne of Jin as Duke Huan, he didn't waste time with celebration. He knew that his greatest test wasn't behind him, it was waiting for him in the south. King Qing of Chu was demanding tribute, and every state in the Central Plains was trembling. But Duke Huan had not survived 19 years of exile by being a coward. He had a plan. He would not attack Chu directly, that would be suicide. Instead, he would use a brilliant, dangerous gambit. He would lure the Chu army deep into Jin territory, stretching their supply lines, then strike with overwhelming force. He knew the generals of Chu were arrogant and overconfident. He was counting on it. The trap was set, and the bait was the entire kingdom of Jin. The stage was being prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of the Chinese world. The Battle of Qinpu was a masterpiece of deception. In the spring of 632 BC, Duke Wen gave the order to retreat, not once, not twice, but 3 times. His own generals were furious, thinking he was a coward. But it was a calculated move, a debt repaid for the kindness King Cheng had shown him during his exile. It was also a brilliant strategy. The Chu army, believing they were pursuing a fleeing enemy, marched deeper and deeper into a trap. Their lines stretched thin, their soldiers exhausted. Then, when the moment was perfect, Duke Wen unleashed his full force. The Jin chariots crashed into the overextended Chu flanks. The battle was a slaughter. The Chu army, once invincible, was shattered. The myth of southern supremacy died on that field. And in a single day, the balance of power in China shifted forever. In the aftermath of Qinpu, Duke Wen of Jin was the undisputed master of the Central Plains. He had not just defeated Chu, he had humiliated them. He now stood on the same pedestal that Duke Huan of Qi had once occupied. He convened a grand alliance at Jiantu, where he was formally recognized as the new hegemon by the king of Zhou himself. It was the highest honor a subject could achieve. But as Duke Wen sat on his new throne of power, he could feel the same poison coursing through his veins that had killed Duke Huan. It was the poison of ambition, not his own, but that of his sons and his ministers. The old king of Jin had many heirs, and each one was sharpening their knives. The age of the hegemons had a grim pattern: build, conquer, and then tear each other apart. The great man had won the war, but he could not win the peace. Duke Wen of Jin died just 8 years after his greatest victory, leaving behind a kingdom drunk on its own glory and a court that was a snake pit of rival factions. The hegemonic order he and Duke Huan had built was now a prize to be fought over, not a principle to be upheld. But the ambition of Jin was now matched by the burning desire for revenge in Chu. They would not forget Qinpu. The next generation of leaders, in both states, were not the wise old men who had forged alliances, they were the angry sons who had inherited a world of conflict. They were preparing for a war that would make the Battle of Qinpu look like a skirmish. But there was one more player in this game, a man who had been quietly watching from the margins. He was a brilliant strategist, a ruthless politician, and he was about to upset the balance of power forever. But that is a story for another time. Do you want to know who dared to challenge both the giants of Jin and Chu? And what dark secret from his past would give him the power to do it? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The next chapter will reveal the man who would become the greatest strategist of the age, and the war that would redefine China. The Grand Alliance at Jiantu was a masterpiece of political theater, but it was a gilded cage. Duke Wen of Jin had reached the absolute pinnacle of power, yet the moment he descended from that stage, the knives came out. His sons, who had fought alongside him in exile, now saw him as a barrier to their own ambitions. The court, once united by the common goal of defeating Chu, fractured into deadly factions. The old duke could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the same instability that had destroyed Duke Huan of Qi. The poison wasn't in his cup, it was in the hearts of his own blood. And when he finally died, 8 years after his triumph, he left behind a kingdom rich with plunder but bankrupt of loyalty. The vultures immediately descended, and the first victim of the new age was not an enemy, but the fragile unity of the hegemonic order itself. The death of Duke Wen was the signal for a civil war that would tear the state of Jin apart. His sons, who had once been allies in exile, now fought each other with a savagery that shocked even the hardened warlords of the age. The orchestrator of this chaos was a man who had been a loyal minister, but now saw an opportunity for absolute power. He played the princes against each other, feeding their paranoia, whispering promises of a crown that was never his to give. The capital city of Jiang was turned into a battlefield, and the blood of the royal family soaked the very stones of the ancestral temples. This was not a war for a principle, it was a war for a corpse, the decaying remains of Duke Wen's legacy. And in the south, the new king of Chu watched the slaughter with a cold, calculating smile, knowing that his moment for revenge was fast approaching. While Jin tore itself apart, a different kind of storm was brewing in the south. King Mu of Chu, the man who had tasted defeat at Qingpu, was dying. But before he passed, he had one last piece of advice for his successor. He looked at his son, a young man known only for his love of pleasure and music, and he saw a perfect mask. A king who appeared weak would not be a target, he would be underestimated. His son, who would become King Zhuang of Chu, took this lesson to heart. He ascended the throne and did nothing. He held no courts, issued no decrees, and spent his days in drunken revelry. The ministers of Chu were furious, but the young king was watching them all. He was identifying the loyal, the ambitious, and the traitorous. And while they laughed at their useless king, he was quietly sharpening the sword of Chu for the greatest war of the age. For 3 years, King Zhuang of Chu played the fool. He let his ministers believe they held the real power. He let the other states think that Chu was no longer a threat. But beneath the surface, he was carefully dismantling his own government. He identified the corrupt ministers who were enriching themselves at the state's expense, and he waited. Then, one day, he made his move. In a single, brutal purge, he executed hundreds of corrupt officials and promoted the loyal men he had been secretly testing. He declared, 3 years without flying, 3 years without singing. But when this bird flies, it will soar to the heavens. When this bird sings, it will stun the world. His ministers finally understood. The fool on the throne was a tiger in disguise. And his first act was to look north, towards the state of Jin, and remember the shame of his father at Qingpu. The tiger had shed his sheep's clothing. King Zhuang of Chu immediately launched a series of brilliant military campaigns against the small states surrounding him, absorbing them into his growing empire. He was not just a warrior, he was a master of strategy and diplomacy. He knew that to defeat Jin, he must first isolate them. He sent envoys to the state of Qi, promising friendship and alliance. He marched his armies to the borders of the state of Zheng, a key ally of Jin, and laid siege to their capital. The Zheng ruler, terrified and abandoned, begged for mercy. King Zhuang's army was unstoppable. The message was clear to all of China, the era of Chu's weakness was over. The new hegemon was not going to ask for a seat at the table, he was going to build his own table and set the rules. The great test was now set for the new leaders of Jin. In the north, the new ruler of Jin, Duke Jing, was young and untested. He inherited a kingdom battered by civil war and a court full of ambitious nobles who cared more for their own power than the fate of the state. They received word of Chu's siege of Zheng, their most important ally. The court was divided. Some argued for a massive military intervention, a direct challenge to Chu. Others, more cautious, warned of the risk of another humiliating defeat like Qingpu. But Duke Jing knew that to do nothing was to surrender the title of hegemon without a fight. He had to march south. He had to face the tiger. The armies of Jin and Chu were now on a collision course, and the entire civilized world watched with bated breath. The Battle of Qingpu had been a clash of titans, but this was shaping up to be something far more terrifying, a war for the very soul of China. What was the young Duke Jing truly made of? And would he be the one to finally break the might of Chu, or would he become another name on the long list of those who failed? The answer was written in blood and fire, and it was coming for them all. If you want to witness the clash that would define a generation, and uncover the dark secret that would give one side a decisive edge, then subscribe and turn on notifications. The next chapter of this epic saga is about to change everything you thought you knew. The drums of war rolled across the plains of central China, a death knell for the old order. Duke Jing of Jin, young and desperate to prove himself, had marched his army south to break the siege of Zheng. It was a march of pride, a gamble to reclaim his state's fading glory. But as his vast columns crossed the Yellow River, scouts returned with chilling news. The army of Chu was not just waiting for them, they were advancing, hungry for a decisive battle. This was not the cautious, defensive Chu of old. This was the army of a king who had waited years in silence, a king who now saw the entire Central Plains as his hunting ground. The two greatest military forces on earth were about to collide near the city of Bai, and the fate of the hegemonic title, the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hung on a knife's edge. The air was thick with tension, and every commander on both sides knew that this single day would redefine the map of China forever. The Battle of Bai was not a single clash but a chaotic, sprawling series of engagements that unfolded over a single day. The Jin army, despite its numbers, was a fractured beast. Its commanders, Sun Linfu and Shi Hui, argued over strategy even as the enemy approached. They were men of the old guard, used to the slow, ritualistic warfare of a bygone era. King Zhuang of Chu, however, had brought a new kind of war. He unleashed his elite vanguard, the King's Guard, to strike first and strike hard, hitting the Jin lines before they were fully formed. The result was pure pandemonium. The Jin center buckled, then collapsed. Soldiers fled not as an army, but as a terrified mob, their bronze armor and chariots becoming instruments of their own demise as they clogged the river crossings. The pride of the north was being slaughtered on the banks of the Bai River, and the color of the water ran red with the blood of a generation. It was a masterclass in military annihilation. The disaster at Bai was more than just a military defeat, it was a psychological blow that shattered the myth of Jin's invincibility. The survivors who limped back north were not just soldiers, they were the broken remnants of an entire generation of aristocrats. Their armor was gone, their chariots were lost, and their pride was ground into the mud of the Central Plains. As they crossed the Yellow River to safety, the river itself seemed to mourn, its currents carrying the echoes of their shame. The nobles of Jin turned on each other, seeking scapegoats for the catastrophe. The state descended into a bitter internal conflict, a disease that would fester for decades. But in the south, King Zhuang of Chu was not content to simply win a battle. He was building an empire. He absorbed the defeated state of Zheng, and then turned his gaze to the next target, the next state that stood between him and total dominance. He was a conqueror, and his appetite was insatiable. For years, King Zhuang of Chu had been patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the old order. The victory at Bai was his declaration to the world. He was no longer a barbarian king from the south, he was the rightful heir to the mandate of heaven. He marched his victorious army to the very borders of the Zhou royal domain, not to attack, but to perform a ritual of immense political theater. He asked a question that sent shockwaves through the ancient world. He asked about the 9 tripod cauldrons, the legendary bronze vessels that symbolized the legitimate rule of the Zhou king over all of China. His question was a threat, a claim that the mandate of heaven had passed from the weak and powerless Zhou to the strong and capable Chu. The Zhou king, a mere puppet in his own palace, could only tremble and offer vague platitudes. The age of the Zhou dynasty, in spirit if not in name, was over. The era of the great regional warlords had truly begun. King Zhuang's question about the cauldrons was a masterstroke. He had won the war, but this was a victory in the realm of legitimacy, far more powerful than any sword. By daring to ask about the sacred vessels, he had publicly declared that the Zhou king was no longer the son of heaven, but just another man. He had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of every ruler in China. If the mandate could be questioned, it could be taken. He returned to his capital in Ing, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a new unifier. He held a grand ceremony, where the rulers of the smaller states, now terrified and in awe of his power, came to pay homage. He was no longer just the hegemon, he was the de facto emperor of the South. The old system of alliances and mutual respect was dead, replaced by a brutal, simple law: submit to Chu, or be crushed by Chu. The chessboard of China had been swept clean, and King Zhuang was setting up the pieces for his own game. The victory of Chu was absolute, but the seeds of its own future troubles were already being sown. King Zhuang was a giant, but he was mortal. And behind him, in the shadows of his own court, a new force was gathering, a force that would one day challenge everything he had built. The mighty state of Jin, humiliated and broken, was not destroyed. It was licking its wounds, and in its despair, it was searching for a new kind of warrior, a new kind of leader who could adapt to this brutal new world. The old noble families, the ones who had failed at Bai, were losing their grip on power. In their place, a new class of men was rising, ruthless, brilliant, and unburdened by the old codes of honor. They were the men who would write the next chapter of this bloody saga. The great clash between Chu and Jin had ended, but the war for the soul of China was far from over. A new power was rising in the west, waiting for its moment to strike. So, who would be the one to unite the warring states? And what dark secret was hidden in the rise of the Qin? If you want to uncover the origins of the dynasty that would finally unite China, and learn about the brutal philosophy that would forge an empire, then subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next chapter will change everything you thought you knew about the birth of a superpower. But triumph, even on this scale, is a dangerous drug. King Zhuang returned to Ing, his capital, and the air was thick with incense and flattery. He had asked about the 9 tripod cauldrons and lived to tell the tale. The Zhou king was a ghost, and Chu was the new emperor in all but name. Yet, in the quiet halls of his palace, a darker thought gnawed at him. His greatest generals, the architects of his victory at Bai, were now heroes to the people. They had tasted glory, and glory is a hunger that never dies. King Zhuang knew that the same ambition that had driven him to the top of the world could just as easily be used to push him off a cliff. He began to see shadows in every corner, to hear whispers in every gust of wind. The banishment of his own chancellor, a man who had served him loyally for decades, was the first sign. The second was the execution of a noble family on a rumor of a plot. He was becoming the very thing he had once sworn to destroy, a tyrant. While Chu basked in its glory, the state of Jin was a wounded beast, licking its wounds in the north. The defeat at Bai had shattered more than its army, it had shattered its identity. The old noble families, the Shi, the Luan, the Fan, had led the charge and led it to ruin. Their arrogance was now a national shame. In the courts of Jiang, the capital, the air was thick with blame and despair. But from this wreckage, a new kind of leader began to emerge. Men who had not been born into the highest ranks of nobility, but who had clawed their way up with sheer talent and ruthlessness. They were the strategists, the administrators, the schemers. They didn't care about honor or glory, they cared about results. They saw that the old ways of chivalrous warfare were suicidal against a power like Chu. They began to rebuild the Jin army, not as a force of aristocratic chariots, but as a professional, disciplined infantry. It was a silent revolution, and its leaders were men like Wei Shu, a general who had learned more from his defeats than from his victories. The old world was dying, but it wasn't going to go quietly. In the small, vulnerable state of Zheng, sandwiched between the giants of Jin and Chu, a young man named Zichan was about to change everything. Zheng was a perpetual battleground, forced to pay tribute to whichever power was stronger at the moment. Its noble families were corrupt, its people were weary. Zichan was not a warrior, he was a thinker, a lawyer. He looked at the chaos around him and saw a simple problem: the law was whatever the powerful said it was. There was no certainty, no justice, only chaos. So, in 536 BC, he did something that shocked the entire aristocratic world. He had the penal code of Zheng cast in bronze, a set of laws that applied to everyone, noble or peasant. This was heresy. The old guard screamed that it would destroy the social order, that it would give the common people too much power. But Zichan saw it as the only way to bring stability. He was planting a seed that would one day grow into a forest of legalism, a philosophy that would reshape China forever. Zichan's Bronze Code was more than just a legal document, it was a declaration. It said that the state was not the personal property of the nobles, but an entity with its own rules. In the turbulent years that followed, his reforms began to bear fruit. Zheng became a stable, prosperous state, a beacon of order amidst the chaos. He didn't just stop at laws. He reformed the land system, taxing the nobles' private estates to fill the state's coffers. He encouraged education, not just of the elite, but of the common people. He was a man who believed in the power of institutions over the whims of individuals. His success was a living insult to the aristocrats of Jin and Chu, who saw their own power waning. They watched as this upstart from a small state became more influential than their own kings. They saw that the future didn't belong to the warrior with the strongest chariot, but to the administrator with the sharpest mind. The old game of honor and conquest was being replaced by a new game of strategy and law. The death of King Zhuang of Chu, which came a few years after his triumph, sent a shockwave through the south. His successors were not of his caliber. They were weak, easily influenced by the powerful noble families he had held in check. The state of Chu, so recently the undisputed hegemon, began to suffer from internal decay. Rivalries between the royal clan and the great noble houses, the Ruo and the Chu, erupted into open conflict. Assassinations became a common tool of political advancement. The mighty military machine that had crushed Jin at Bai began to rust, its campaigns becoming less about conquest and more about propping up the authority of a failing dynasty. It was a classic tragedy. The empire builder had created a monster of power, but he had no heir strong enough to control it. The south was a cauldron of ambition and treachery, and the fear of Chu, which had once united the smaller states, began to fade. They started looking north again, wondering if the time of Jin's revenge had finally come. As Chu collapsed into itself and Jin plotted its revival, the smaller states looked on with a growing sense of dread. The old balance of power was gone. The world was becoming simpler and more brutal. There would be no more middle ground, no more buffer states. You were either with the north or with the south, or you were crushed between them. This was the reality that dawned on the rulers of states like Qi, Qin, and Yan. They watched the giants fight and knew that their own survival depended on choosing sides, and choosing correctly. The era of the hegemon was over, the era of the warring states was beginning. It was a time when a single strategic mistake could mean the annihilation of your entire family, your entire state. The chessboard was set for a conflict so vast, so devastating, that it would redefine the meaning of power in China. The only question was, who would have the vision, and the ruthlessness, to survive the coming storm? The answer, hidden in the western mountains, would shock the world. The flames of civil war in Jin were not extinguished, they were merely banked, waiting for the next gust of wind. And that wind came in the form of a man named Luan Shu, a noble whose ambition was as vast as the plains of the north. He saw the weakness in Duke Li, the ruler who had inherited the throne after the disaster at Bai. Duke Li was a man of suspicion, surrounded by sycophants and distant from the military aristocracy that formed the backbone of Jin's power. Luan Shu played on this fear, whispering of conspiracies and plotting with other disaffected clans. The final act was swift and brutal. In a coup that shocked the Central Plains, Yuan Shu had Duke Li arrested and placed under house arrest. Within months, the deposed duke was dead, and a new ruler, Duke Dao, was placed on the throne. It was a violent reminder that in this age, the mandate of heaven was not given, it was taken. Duke Dao was not the puppet the conspirators had hoped for. He was young, but he was shrewd, and he understood a brutal truth: his power rested not on his birthright, but on his ability to command the loyalty of the great families. He saw how Yuan Shu and his allies had grown fat on the spoils of their coup, and he knew they were a threat. But instead of striking at them directly, he adopted a different strategy. He surrounded himself with talented and loyal advisors, men like Han Ju, a brilliant strategist from a lesser noble family. Han Ju understood that the key to Jin's revival was not internal purity, but external victory. He counseled Duke Dao to rebuild the army, to focus on discipline and tactics, and to wait for the right moment to strike at Chu. The Duke listened. He poured resources into the military, he rewarded merit over birth, and he began to forge a new elite, loyal not to any clan, but to him and to the state of Jin. While Jin was quietly rebuilding its strength, the states caught in the middle were terrified. The smaller states like Zheng and Chen, which had been battlegrounds for over a century, were the first to feel a shift in the wind. Envoys from Jin began to arrive at their courts, bearing gifts and promises of protection. But these were not the same empty promises of old, they were backed by a new, visible military power. Duke Dao was not just building an army, he was building a network of alliances. He reached out to the state of Qi, which had long chafed under Chu's dominance, and he secured a promise of neutrality from the state of Qin in the west. The web of influence was being spun, and at its center sat the young duke, a spider patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The other states knew a storm was coming, they just didn't know where it would break first. The southern giant, Chu, was still recovering from its own internal strife, unaware that a new threat was gathering in the north. The first major test of Jin's revival came not in a grand battle, but in a campaign to reclaim the state of Zheng. For years, Zheng had been a vassal of Chu, forced to pay tribute and provide troops. Now, with Jin's army marching towards its borders, the ruler of Zheng was faced with an impossible choice. Submit to Jin and face the wrath of Chu, or remain loyal to Chu and face the new, more terrible army of Jin. It was a no-win situation. Duke Dao did not give him time to think. The Jin army moved with a speed and precision that stunned the other states. They crossed the Yellow River and descended upon Zheng before its ruler could even muster a response. The city was besieged, not with brute force, but with a calculated show of power. The message was clear, the balance of power had shifted. Jin was back, and it was not asking for allies, it was demanding them. The fate of Zheng was a warning to every small state caught between the two giants. The fall of Zheng sent a shockwave through the court of Chu. The new king, Gong, was a man of limited vision. He had inherited a kingdom that was still bleeding from the internal conflicts that followed King Zhuang's death. The noble families, the Ruo and the Chu, were more interested in their own power than in the glory of the kingdom. They saw Jin's aggression as a mere nuisance, a border skirmish that could be dealt with later. King Gong, however, knew that this was no skirmish. This was a challenge to the very foundation of Chu's supremacy. He called for a council of war, but the nobles were divided. Some argued for a full-scale mobilization, while others urged caution, citing the need to consolidate power at home. The king's own advisors were weak, and his orders were met with hesitation. In the end, they did nothing. They allowed Jin's victory to stand unchallenged. It was a fatal miscalculation. The image of Chu as an invincible power was shattered, and the smaller states began to flock to Jin's banner, seeking protection from the new rising sun. With Chu paralyzed by indecision, Duke Dao of Jin saw his moment. He knew that a single victory over a minor state was not enough to secure his dominance. He needed a decisive confrontation, a battle that would break the spirit of the South forever. He sent a formal challenge to Chu, demanding they meet him on the field of battle to settle the question of supremacy. It was a bold, arrogant move, and it forced King Gong's hand. He could not refuse without losing all face. As the Jin army marched south, the entire chessboard of China held its breath. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The two greatest powers in the land were about to collide in a war that would decide the fate of the Central Plains for generations. The old alliances, the old fears, the old loyalties were all about to be tested in the crucible of war. The only question that remained was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? And what secrets would be revealed in the aftermath of the coming storm? The story of the dynasties is not just a tale of kings and battles, but of the invisible forces that shape them. What was the hidden strategy that Duke Dao was about to unleash? To discover that, you'll have to stay with us as the saga of the dynasties of ancient China continues. The armies met at Yanling, a name that would be carved into the history of China with blood and fire. Jin's forces were disciplined, their banners snapping in the wind, but Chu's army was massive, a wall of bronze and leather that stretched across the plains. King Gong of Chu watched from his war chariot, confident in his numbers. But Duke Dao of Jin had a secret weapon, not a new sword, not a siege engine, but a strategy born from the chaos of generations. He had studied Chu's weaknesses, their reliance on sheer force, their fragile chain of command. As the sun climbed higher, the Jin army didn't charge. Instead, they shifted, splitting into smaller, agile units. It was a move that confused Chu's commanders. They had expected a single, crushing blow, not a swarm of assassins. The first wave of Jin archers unleashed a storm of arrows, but it was the second wave, the flanking infantry, that broke through the enemy lines. King Gong watched in horror as his elite guard was cut down. It was a new kind of warfare, and he was not prepared for it. As the battle raged, King Gong of Chu realized he was losing control. His left flank was collapsing, his center was being pushed back, and his orders were lost in the chaos. In a desperate act, he ordered his personal guard to charge, hoping to break the Jin line with a single, bold stroke. He led the charge himself, his chariot thundering across the field. But fate, that cruel mistress, had other plans. An arrow, loosed from a Jin bow, found its mark. It struck King Gong in the eye. The king screamed, clutching his face as blood poured through his fingers. The charge faltered. His guards, seeing their king wounded, panicked. They pulled him from the chariot, their morale shattered. In that moment, the battle was lost. But as the Chu forces began to retreat, a single general, Yang Yuji, rallied a small group of soldiers. He knew the king was vulnerable, and he would not let him fall. With a ferocity that stunned the Jin pursuers, he cut a path through the enemy lines, dragging the wounded king to safety. The war for supremacy was over, but the fight for survival had just begun. The defeat at Yanling was a blow from which Chu would never fully recover. King Gong, blinded in one eye, returned to his capital a broken man. The myth of Chu's invincibility was dead, and the smaller states, once fearful of its power, now looked to Jin for leadership. Duke Dao of Jin didn't waste a moment. He knew that victory in battle was only the first step. He needed to consolidate his power, to turn his military success into lasting political dominance. He summoned the leaders of the allied states to a grand conference, a display of Jin's new authority. But even as he basked in his triumph, a new threat was brewing in the east. The state of Qi, long a rival of Jin, saw the chaos as an opportunity. They began to test Jin's borders, raiding small towns and challenging its authority. Duke Dao knew he couldn't ignore this challenge. He had to act decisively, or risk losing everything he had just won. The chessboard of China was always in motion, and the game was far from over. Duke Dao's response to Qi was swift and merciless. He wasn't going to wait for an invasion, he was going to take the fight to their doorstep. He led his army eastward, a forced march that caught the Qi forces completely off guard. The Battle of Pinyin was not a grand affair like Yanling, but it was brutal and decisive. The Jin army, battle-hardened and confident, smashed through the Qi defenses. The Qi ruler, Duke Ling, was forced to flee his capital, leaving behind his family and his treasures. For Duke Dao, it was the final piece of the puzzle. He had defeated the south, and now he had humiliated the east. There was no power left that could challenge his authority. The other states, from the smallest fiefdom to the once mighty Chu, were now his vassals in all but name. He was the undisputed master of the Central Plains, the first true hegemon since the days of Duke Huan of Qi. But as he stood on the ruins of his enemies, he knew that this power was a burden, not a gift. He had to hold it together, or watch it all crumble. But the seeds of Jin's own destruction were already being sown. Duke Dao's power rested on the loyalty of powerful noble families within his own state, families like the Han, the Zhao, and the Wei. They had fought for him, bled for him, and they expected their rewards. They were given land, titles, and, most importantly, military command. But this created a dangerous dynamic. The more powerful these families became, the more they began to see themselves as rivals to the Duke, not his subjects. Their ambitions were not for the glory of Jin, but for their own survival and dominance. They were like vipers in the bosom of the state, waiting for the moment when the Duke's authority would weaken. Duke Dao was a strong ruler, but he was mortal. The question was not if this internal struggle would erupt, but when. And as he grew older, the wolves began to circle. The golden age of Jin was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was slowly rising. As Duke Dao's star began to fade, a new and terrifying force emerged from the shadows of the east. His name was Wu Zixu, a man with a face like a storm and a heart full of vengeance. His father and brother had been brutally murdered by the king of Chu, and he had fled into exile, swearing an oath of blood. He found a patron in the state of Wu, a once barbaric kingdom that was rapidly learning the arts of war and civilization. Wu Zixu was not just a general, he was a master of strategy, a man who could see 10 moves ahead on the chessboard of power. He whispered to the king of Wu, telling him of the weakness of the Central Plains, of the corruption of Jin, of the wounds of Chu. He promised him not just survival, but domination. And with that promise, he set in motion a plan that would shatter the old order forever. The age of the hegemons was ending. A new, more brutal era was about to begin. But what was his true secret? What was the hidden strategy that would bring the great states to their knees? To uncover that, you'll have to stay with us as the saga of the dynasties of ancient China continues. The golden age of Jin, however, was built on a powder keg. Duke Dao, for all his brilliance, had empowered the very men who would one day tear his state apart. The Zhao, the Wei, the Han, these noble families now controlled vast armies and territories. They were loyal today, but loyalty in the spring and autumn period was a commodity that could be bought and sold. And the currency was power. As the Duke's health began to fail, these families weren't just preparing for his death, they were preparing for the war of succession that would follow. They forged alliances in secret, married their children into each other's houses, and stockpiled weapons. The state of Jin, the undisputed hegemon of the Central Plains, was a giant with a terminal illness, and its own organs were beginning to devour it from within. The question that haunted every minister's mind was not if this internal struggle would erupt, but when, and who would be left standing when the dust settled. But while Jin rotted from within, a new and terrifying force was rising in the east, one that would not just challenge the old order but shatter it completely. This force was the state of Wu, once dismissed as a land of tattooed barbarians. Its king, Helu, was ambitious, but he was just a weapon. The true architect of Wu's ascent was a man named Wu Zixu. He was a ghost, a man whose family had been slaughtered by the king of Chu, and his entire existence had become a vessel for vengeance. He had fled to Wu with nothing but a burning hatred and a mind sharper than any blade. He saw the weakness of the southern states, the corruption of the northern ones, and he knew that the time of the old hegemons was over. He trained Wu's soldiers into a professional army, instilled discipline, and built a war machine unlike anything the Central Plains had ever seen. And he was waiting, watching, for the perfect moment to strike his mortal enemy. Wu Zixu wasn't alone in his quest. He had found a brilliant partner in a man known to history as Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War. This wasn't just a philosopher, this was a master of psychological warfare. He understood that battles were won before a single arrow was fired, by manipulating the enemy's perception, by sowing discord, by attacking their plans and alliances. Under his guidance, the army of Wu didn't just fight, they outthought their opponents. They used spies to spread misinformation, they created elaborate feints to mislead the Chu generals, and they struck with such speed and precision that the enemy never knew what hit them. Sun Tzu's genius was not in brute force, but in the subtle art of creating chaos in the enemy's mind while maintaining perfect order in his own ranks. This was a new kind of warfare, a terrifying evolution that would make the old noble battles of Jin and Chu look like children's games. The moment Wu Zixu had been waiting for finally arrived. The king of Chu, the man who had ordered his family's execution, was dead. His son, King Zhao, was a weak and inexperienced ruler. The state of Chu was in turmoil, its leadership divided. It was time to strike. In 506 BC, the armies of Wu launched a massive invasion. Instead of marching directly into the heavily fortified border, Sun Tzu and Wu Zixu devised a brilliant strategy. They advanced along a difficult and unexpected route, deep into Chu's territory, bypassing the main defensive positions. The Chu generals, arrogant and overconfident, marched out to meet them, sure of a quick victory. But they were walking into a trap. The army of Wu was fast, disciplined, and they knew the terrain. They lured the Chu forces into a narrow valley near the Baiju River, and then they sprang the trap. It was a massacre. The Battle of Baiju was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Chu army, over 200,000 strong, was caught in a devastating ambush. The soldiers of Wu attacked from 5 different directions, their formations perfectly coordinated. The Chu forces, wedged into a narrow space, had no room to maneuver. They were cut down by volleys of arrows, then charged by Wu's elite infantry. The river Baiju ran red with blood. The Chu generals were killed, their army scattered to the winds. In a matter of days, the unstoppable army of Wu marched on the Chu capital of Ing. The king of Chu fled in terror, leaving his city to its fate. For the first time in over a century, the capital of the great southern power had fallen to an enemy. This wasn't just a defeat, it was an annihilation. The shockwave of this event would be felt across the entire known world, proving that the old order of the spring and autumn period was dead, and a new, more brutal era of total war had begun. The fall of Ing was a victory for Wu Zixu, but it was not enough. He had captured the city, but the king of Chu had escaped. His vengeance was incomplete. He was so consumed by his hatred that he ordered the tomb of the previous king, his father's murderer, to be opened. He dragged the corpse out, whipped it for his father and brother, and scattered its bones to the winds. It was an act of shocking, barbaric fury that horrified the entire civilized world. But even with this gruesome act, the war was not over. Chu, though beaten, was not dead. A loyal minister, Shen Baoshu, traveled to the state of Qin and wept for 7 days and 7 nights in front of the Qin court until they agreed to send an army to help. The Qin forces combined with the remnants of Chu's army and pushed the invaders back. But the damage was done. The myth of Chu's invincibility was broken, and the ruthless ambition of Wu had revealed the future of warfare. And now, a new question loomed over the ruins. With Chu humbled and Jin decaying, who would be the next to fall? And what new secret weapon would decide the fate of the next dynasty? To uncover that, you'll have to stay with us as the saga of the dynasties of ancient China continues. With the capital of Chu in ashes, the state of Wu had reached the pinnacle of its power. King Helu, however, did not live to savor his greatest triumph. He died of his wounds shortly after the fall of Ying, leaving the throne to his son, King Fuchai. Fuchai was not the patient strategist his father had been, he was a man of raw ambition and burning pride. He saw the devastation of Chu and believed that Wu was invincible, that no force on earth could stand against his armies. This arrogance would prove to be his greatest weakness. While he was consolidating his power, a new threat was brewing to the south, in a state that had long been dismissed as a backward, semi-barbaric land. That state was Yu, and its king was a man named Gojian, who had watched the fall of Chu with a mixture of fear and calculated ambition. He knew that Wu's next target would be his own kingdom, and he was determined to strike first. The war between Wu and Yu was inevitable, and it came to a head at the Battle of Zueli. King Fuchai, confident in his overwhelming strength, led his army deep into Yu territory. But Gojian, knowing he was outmatched in a pitched battle, used a desperate gambit. He sent a group of condemned criminals to the front lines of the Wu army, where they committed suicide in a gruesome display. The Wu soldiers, shocked and confused by the spectacle, lowered their guard. In that moment of hesitation, Gojian launched a ferocious surprise attack. The Wu army was thrown into disarray, and Fuchai was forced to retreat. It was a stunning, humiliating defeat for the young king. But Gojian, instead of pressing his advantage, made a fatal mistake. He misjudged the strength of Wu's remaining forces and decided to pursue them. Fuchai, with his back against the wall, rallied his troops. He offered a massive reward to any soldier who could bring him the head of Gojian, turning the battle into a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. The Battle of Zueli became a rout. Gojian's forces were annihilated, and he himself was surrounded. With his army shattered and his kingdom on the verge of collapse, he faced a choice, death or total submission. He chose submission. Gojian sent his minister, Wen Zhong, to the Wu camp with a humble offer. He would surrender himself, his family, and his kingdom to Fuchai, becoming his most loyal vassal. Fuchai, intoxicated by his victory, was about to accept. But his chief minister, Wu Zishu, the man who had orchestrated Wu's rise, warned him against it. He saw Gojian not as a defeated king, but as a viper waiting to strike. He told Fuchai, "If you do not kill him, you will live to regret it. He will be the death of you and your kingdom." But Fuchai, blinded by his pride and his desire to humiliate his enemy, ignored the warning. He accepted Gojian's surrender and spared his life, a decision that would seal his own fate and the fate of his dynasty. Gojian was taken to Wu as a captive, forced to live in a small stone hut and tend to Fuchai's horses. For 3 years, he endured unspeakable humiliation, acting as the most obedient and loyal servant. He even tasted Fuchai's excrement to diagnose his illness, an act of such abject submission that it convinced Fuchai of his complete loyalty. The Wu king, moved by this display, finally released his captive and allowed him to return to his ruined kingdom. But Gojian's submission was a mask. The humiliation he suffered had forged his will into an unbreakable blade. Back in Yu, he slept on a bed of firewood and hung a gall bladder from his roof, tasting its bitter bile every day to remind himself of his vengeance. He and his ministers, Wen Zhong and family, began a secret plan to rebuild Yu's strength. They knew they could not match Wu's military might, so they decided to destroy it from within. They would weaken Wu's economy, corrupt its officials, and turn its king against his most capable advisors. The most dangerous weapon in Gojian's arsenal was not an army, but a woman. His minister, Fan Li, scoured the kingdom to find the most beautiful and intelligent women, and he found two, Xia and Jingdan. Xia was renowned for her ethereal beauty, a woman so lovely that even the fish in the pond would forget to swim when she passed by. She was trained for years in music, dance, and the art of seduction. Her mission was simple, to win the heart of King Fuchai and blind him with love. In 490 BCE, she was presented to Fuchai as a tribute from the defeated state of Yu. Fuchai, captivated by her beauty, was immediately smitten. He built lavish palaces for her, neglected his duties, and slowly began to listen to her every word. Under her influence, he grew increasingly distrustful of his loyal minister, Wu Zishu. The seeds of division were sown, and the once mighty state of Wu began to rot from within, while Yu quietly rebuilt its army and stockpiled its resources, waiting for the moment to strike. By 482 BCE, King Fuchai's obsession with Xia and his arrogance had driven Wu to the brink. He had launched a massive campaign against the state of Qi, leaving his capital, Gusu, virtually undefended. This was the moment Gojian had been waiting for. He launched a sudden, devastating attack on Wu's heartland, catching Fuchai completely off guard. The Wu army, exhausted from its campaigns, was shattered. Fuchai returned to find his kingdom in ruins, his capital captured, and his power broken. He was forced to sue for peace, but Gojian was not as merciful as he had been. He offered Fuchai a small, isolated island for his exile. Fuchai, realizing the depth of his folly, refused. He committed suicide, covering his face with his sleeve, ashamed to face Wu Zishu in the afterlife. With his death, the once mighty state of Wu was extinguished. The southern threat was gone, but the question that now hung over the lands of China was more terrifying than ever. If a small, backward state like Yu could topple the greatest military power of the age, what did that mean for the rest of the world? And where was the legendary strategist Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, who had vanished after the fall of Chu? Did he have a hand in this new order, and what other secrets of warfare was he waiting to reveal? To find out, you'll have to subscribe and join us for the next chapter, where a new power will rise from the chaos and reshape the destiny of the Middle Kingdom. With the state of Wu extinguished, a single question burned across the war-torn plains of China: who would be next? Yu was the victor, but it was a kingdom built on ash and vengeance. King Gojian had learned the bitterest lesson of survival, not from a general, but from his own humiliation. For years, he had slept on a bed of brushwood and tasted gall every single morning, forcing himself to never forget the shame of his defeat. This was not just a king's ritual, it was a nation's obsession. He tore down the old aristocratic order, rewarding farmers and soldiers who proved their loyalty, while his brilliant minister, Wen Zhong, devised a seven-pronged plan to bleed Wu dry. They gave gifts of precious timber to Fuchai, hoping to exhaust his treasury on grand palaces. They bribed his officials and sowed discord. But the most brilliant stroke was yet to come. This was the moment for the most dangerous weapon of all, a woman. Fan Li, Gojian's spymaster and strategist, knew that no army could break Wu's military might. But they could break its king. He searched the rivers and villages of Yu for two women of extraordinary beauty and intelligence. He found Xia, a humble laundry girl whose reflection could make fish forget to swim, and Jingdan, her equally captivating companion. They were not just beautiful, they were trained for years in the arts of seduction, music, and courtly intrigue. They were taught to read Fuchai's desires, to feed his ego, and to blind him with love. In 490 BCE, they were presented to Fuchai as a tribute from a defeated Yu. Fuchai, arrogant and confident, saw them as trophies, not threats. He had no idea that he was inviting vipers into his bed. King Fuchai, the once mighty conqueror, fell harder than any warrior could have predicted. Xia was not just beautiful, she was a mirror reflecting everything he wanted to see. She praised his greatness, laughed at his jokes, and gently whispered suspicions about his most loyal minister, Wu Zishu. Day by day, Fuchai built her grand palaces, the most famous being the Guanhua Palace, or the Palace of Beautiful Women, constructed on a hillside with a corridor of singing tiles. He spent the state's treasury on her every whim, while the army grew complacent and the treasury ran dry. Wu Zishu, the old warhorse who had made Wu great, saw the poison seeping in. He begged Fuchai to see the truth, to destroy you before it was too late. But Fuchai, blinded by Xia's flattery, saw only a traitor in his midst. He ordered Wu Zishu to commit suicide, a gift to the woman he loved. The death of Wu Zishu was the signal Gojian had been waiting for. The dragon of Yu was finally ready to strike. For years, he had patiently sharpened his claws. He had implemented a policy to increase the population, rewarding couples who had children and punishing those who didn't. He had trained a new generation of soldiers, hardened by poverty and fueled by a burning desire for revenge. And in 482 BCE, the opportunity came. Fuchai, eager to prove his dominance on the northern plains, marched his main army out of Wu to a grand meeting with the other states, leaving his capital, Gusu, dangerously exposed. Gojian launched his attack with a force of over 50,000 elite soldiers. They didn't just attack, they devoured. In a lightning campaign, they captured Gusu, killing Fuchai's crown prince. Fuchai, hearing the news from the north, was frozen in disbelief. Fuchai raced back to his kingdom, but it was too late. He found his capital in ruins, his army shattered, and his power gone. He was forced to send a desperate plea for peace, a haunting echo of the mercy he had shown Gojian years before. But Gojian was not a man of mercy, he was a man of vengeance. He refused Fuchai's pleas and offered him a choice, a small, isolated island for his exile. Fuchai, the proud king who had once ruled the waves, could not bear the shame. He saw the ghosts of his past, the face of Wu Zishu, staring at him through the veil of his own folly. He covered his face with his sleeve and took his own life. With his final breath, the great state of Wu was no more. The world was stunned. A backward, barbarian state in the south had toppled the most powerful military machine of the age. The fall of Wu was a cataclysm that shook the foundations of the known world. If a state like Yu could destroy the greatest power, then no throne was safe. King Gojian, now the undisputed hegemon of the south, held a grand meeting of the remaining states, forcing them to acknowledge his supremacy. But the victory was hollow. The old order was dead. The spring and autumn period was staggering to its end, and a new, more brutal age was dawning. And what of the phantom who had set this all in motion? Sun Tzu, the master of war whose art of war had built Wu's army, had vanished into the mist after the fall of Chu. Did he watch from the shadows as his masterpiece of strategy brought down another kingdom? And as the states of the north, Jin, Qi, and Qin, looked upon the ashes of Wu, what deadly new games were they preparing to play? The chaos was only just beginning. What secrets did the mysterious Sun Tzu still hold, and who would be the first to wield his forgotten genius in the coming storm? To uncover the next chapter in this epic saga, subscribe now and join us for the final episode. King Gojian stood atop the ruins of Gusu, the capital of Wu, and the silence was deafening. The kingdom that had once made the world tremble was now nothing but ash and memory. He had won. He was the undisputed master of the south, the last great hegemon of the spring and autumn era. But as he looked at the bodies of his enemies, a chilling truth settled over him like a shroud. The victory had not been his alone. It had been orchestrated by the mind of a ghost, a strategist named Sun Tzu, who had vanished into the mist years ago. And now, with the war over, new, more insidious battlefield emerged, the court of Yu itself. The very tools of his triumph, the cunning ministers and the beautiful spy, were now the greatest threats to his throne. Go Jian's first act as hegemon was to summon the remaining feudal lords to a grand meeting at Pengcheng. It was a display of raw power, a demand for their submission. Yet, even as they bowed, he saw the fear in their eyes, not of him, but of the chaos he represented. The old rules of chivalry were dead. War was no longer a game of honor, it was a brutal struggle for survival. And in this new world, Go Jian knew that the men who had helped him rise were now liabilities. He began to eye his most trusted advisors with suspicion, particularly the brilliant strategist Wen Zhong, whose advice had been the bedrock of his revenge. The king's paranoia was a poison, and it was spreading. He started to wonder, who would be the first to betray him now that the common enemy was gone? The rumors began to spread like wildfire. Wen Zhong, the architect of Yu's victory, was becoming too powerful. The people praised him more than they praised the king. Go Jian, his mind twisted by suspicion, could not tolerate a shadow that loomed larger than his own. He made a fatal decision. He summoned Wen Zhong and, with a cold, calculated voice, offered him a poisoned sword, telling him to kill himself for his crimes. Wen Zhong, the loyal servant who had sacrificed everything, looked at the blade and laughed. He saw the hand of fate in this, the same fate that had befallen Wu Zixu. He took the sword and ended his life, leaving behind a legend of loyalty and a warning about the nature of power. The king had just killed the very mind that had secured his kingdom, a strategic blunder that would haunt you for generations. The death of Wen Zhong sent a shockwave through Go Jian's court. His other great ally, the visionary Fan Li, saw the writing on the wall. He knew he would be next. Fan Li was no fool, he understood that the king's paranoia was a bottomless pit. So, on a moonless night, he gathered his wealth and, with the legendary beauty Shi Shi by his side, vanished from the kingdom of Yu without a trace. Some say they sailed away to the east, living a quiet life as merchants. Others whisper that they became powerful lords in the state of Qi. But the most haunting tale is that they were seen together on a lake, their reflection shimmering in the water, a perfect image of escape from a world of treachery. Their disappearance left Go Jian more isolated and paranoid than ever. He had conquered the world, but he was utterly alone. Go Jian ruled for a few more years, but the fire in his heart had turned to cold ash. The world he had conquered was a hollow prize. He had lost his most loyal advisors, and his kingdom was slowly stagnating without their wisdom. He died a lonely and bitter man, and with him, the age of the hegemons died as well. The southern threat was gone, and the northern states of Jin, Qi, and Qin, who had watched the fall of Wu with a mix of horror and fascination, now turned their gaze upon one another. The old balance of power was shattered. The state of Jin, torn apart by internal strife, was on the verge of collapse. Its most powerful families, the Han, Zhao, and Wei, were preparing to carve up the kingdom for themselves. The spring and autumn period was over. The true war for the soul of China was about to begin. And so, the question that haunts this entire saga remains unanswered. Sun Tzu, the man who wrote The Art of War, the phantom warrior who built Wu's army and set this entire catastrophe in motion, vanished into the mist. Did he die in obscurity, a forgotten genius? Or did he, like Fan Li, escape to a distant land, watching as his principles of deception and strategy were used to tear the world apart? His book was a weapon, and now it was loose in the world. The next rulers to wield it would not be chivalrous lords, but ruthless kings who would define a new era of total war. The warring states period was dawning. And the secrets of Sun Tzu's final days, the true origin of his genius, and the fate of his legend, are the keys to understanding the brutal centuries to come. Who will be the first warlord to unlock the final, hidden chapter of his strategy, and how will it reshape the world? Subscribe now to uncover the greatest military mystery of the ancient world and witness the birth of the Age of Empires.